Well, we're beginning, in a sense, our second major unit in the course. We're flipping the pages, going into a new chapter, Chapter 5. We're beginning to talk about persuasion. In one way, it would be logical to have both information and persuasion on the same exam, but then it just doesn't work out well that way. And the reason I say that is that in one sense, persuasion and information are very parallel terms, and it's sometimes unfortunate, not only because of the way you may be taught, but sometimes how you think, that there is this great gap between information and persuasion. And I say that, having warned you when we talked about information, that I don't see a clear distinction between inform and persuade. I'm willing to say that if you say something that informs me, I could also say that persuades me that you're right, that this is accurate, that this is something that I should use to reduce my uncertainty, to put it back in the context that we've talked about. We also have this strange notion sometimes that information is never manipulated and persuasion is inherent manipulation. And I try to avoid that because we can use information, we can use misinformation, we can use disinformation in a persuasive, manipulative context. So it's unfortunate if we get the feeling, and I try to address this at the beginning of both chapters, that there's some great gap, chasm, difference between thinking about information as information and persuasion as persuasion. One of the other themes that I want to talk about fairly early is, in a sense, if we can get this first screen up, the notion of persuasion, in my mind, comes back very, very close to what I might have suggested as a definition of communication in the very beginning of the course. Did we, during the first day or two, certainly within the first 2 weeks, suggest that communication is the processes of social influence? Did that sort of sound right? That we influence one another, we are influenced, and we influence one another towards some kind of collective working together, living together, and sometimes even living apart and fighting. We know that symbols can be used to bring people together, symbols can be used to divide us. Then when I come into this part of the course and I say, maybe persuasion is the process of social influence, or the dynamics of social influence. And you say, well, isn't that how we defined communication? And I'm saying, well, what if we were to say that communication and persuasion are almost the same? Now you see that really screws people's heads up if they have been told that persuasion is inherent manipulation and always ethically bad. Then it's like saying communication is unethical and inherently bad, and it can really lead to some confusion. So in one sense, what I have to do is to acknowledge that you may come into the discussion of persuasion with a lot of conceptions that may differ from mine. So on the one hand, I have to deal with people that want to be very cautious about persuasion. I also know, having taught generations of communication students, that some of you are really in here similar to students studying psychology. You want to know the deal. You know, you want to know psychology so you can manipulate everybody around you. You want to be in here so that you can manipulate everybody around you. And we typically call those advertising students. Just teasing. But the students sometimes who say that advertising is my passion are the ones that like persuasion theory most, and people who often then say it's because I can get people to do what I want or get people to do what my employer wants. And then I simply say, well, if it were all that easy, then wouldn't one ad agency run the world? Wouldn't we all be of the same opinion? Because somebody would have figured out how to do that, and so probably it fails. So wherein all of this is a reasonable way to think about what persuasion theory is and how persuasion theory has grown up. One way to do that is to sort of flip back in the history of time and know that persuasion, and I suggested this very early on, is probably the oldest aspect of the study of communication. Persuasion is probably the oldest aspect of communication. Let's assume that you're not a creationist, and you can imagine back individuals sitting around in a sort of human, or even maybe you want to say a pre-human condition, learning to begin to work together. Is it likely that they begin early on to realize that certain people in the group can influence other members of the group different? More, less, whatever it might be. I'm willing to argue that social cooperation and persuasion are so much a part of the human mind, identity, and history that there is no way that we can ever separate that out. Clearly, when we begin to see major turning points in the civilization of society, the study of persuasion becomes a very telling part of that. Western culture derives that origin heavily, if we can get the overview chapter, or the overview page up, derives that heavily from the Greek culture about 2,400 years ago. And I talked about that in chapter 2, where we talked about one of the oldest influences in the study of communication theory is rhetorical theory, going back most particularly to the Greeks and to the Romans, who thought a lot about that. The 2,000-year history of theory on persuasion. How do we influence one another? How do we make collective decisions? What's the nature of a democratic society? Isn't the essence of a democratic society the opportunity for you to convince me that you're right and I'm wrong? Isn't it the opportunity of me to say, no, I think I'm right and you're wrong? Isn't that the nature of who we are as human beings? And it's out of that quandary, how do we influence one another, that we then begin to see the evolution of our interest in persuasion. One can argue that it addresses the human incentive to influence and be influenced, knowing that as collective beings we simply have to work in various ways together. And we know at various times we can influence and we can also be influenced. I will argue, and a writer by the name of Piaget, who studied children's development, says that the awareness of the ability to influence is one of the earliest moments of awareness on the part of the child. When the child learns that the parents begin to respond to the cry of the child, one could argue the child has learned to be persuasive. When the child recognizes that the parents will respond to its cry, the child now is beginning to be thoughtful about communication, thoughtful about persuasion. I can influence my parents. I can get something. That matures over time, doesn't it? Is it any kind of magic to us that when you are at the checkout counter in your grocery store, that on the one hand are all of these magazines that are supposed to be alluring to the mother, while behind her is all of this candy. Mom is held hostage checking out while the brood is sitting there imagining Reese's peanut butter cups. And I focus on that because I'm addicted to Reese's peanut butter cups, and know that if I were a 2-, 3-, 4-year-old child, that while mom is trying to check out, there would be nothing in my mind more important than figuring out a way to get mom to dole out 44 cents. That's what they cost currently at Kroger. 44 cents, not a bad deal. I have to pay 75 cents for them over at the Cougar Den. The essence of society, then, is the ability to cooperate and coordinate human activity. Now, whether you like that or not, I could build a pretty strong case for it. I could even go further using the work of a woman by the name of Mary Douglas from England and argue that the whole nature of society is the collective management of risk. And in part, you see, that even goes back to our crosswalk out there, the collective management of risk. We set rules and we expect people to adopt and act according to a variety of rules. We've got to have a kind of orderly society. Persuasion then can be approached by, as requiring an examination of key assumptions. One of the most apparent connections between communication theory and psychology is in the area of persuasion theory. We're going to see a number of psychologists, not to suggest that communication scholars themselves haven't done a lot of good persuasion research, but we're going to turn heavily to a group of psychologists to see many of these theories emerge. What's also interesting is to note that the communication influence on the study of psychology is as early as the 40s and 50s. Because people at one of the great research institutions studying persuasion, Yale, used a communication model provided by communication theorists to speculate where they ought to investigate the points of influence, and we'll see more of that later on. Persuasion will necessarily, as other aspects of our study, be approached as the appreciation of and critique of several competing theories. I know that communication students at some point say, why don't you wait until you get all of these theories boiled down to just one, teach us that one, and save us all the trouble. But unfortunately, it isn't the way the world works. And even if there is a sort of evolutionary model, sometimes we have to go back to the beginning and say, for instance, in this case, that the Yale learning theory persuasion studies really started it all. And if we don't study them as a foundation, and some of what they discovered is still pretty good, we really won't know where we are today and why we're studying some of the things that we are being attentive to today. As so often is the case, we can rummage around to find lots of different definitions. Uses of messages to modify behavior by using some combination of coercive force and appeals that affect reason and emotion. We can look at that and say, do you like that as a definition? I find it problematic that we separate reason and emotion. But I know that there's a literature out there, even today, that suggests that there are rational persuasive processes and there are affective or emotional persuasive processes. Well, see, that bothers me. If I walk in as a father and I see my daughter, or now my granddaughter, asleep in bed, and you parents will understand this, and people that have never had children won't know what I'm talking about. But I think when you walk in and see your child asleep, in my mind, that's one of the greatest emotional moments in my life. Yes. Oh, the screen is not up. I'm sorry. Could you put up toward a definition? I'm sorry. Thanks for bringing that to my attention. Is it irrational to have an emotional rush when you see your child peacefully asleep? See, I don't think so. I think it's a very rational thing. I think that it defines my sense of who I am as a parent. That the fact that my child can sleep peacefully. One of the things that always worries me is when I see children caught up in the horrors of war. So I really do believe that children deserve an era of innocence. And I say that in a little bit of a way because I'm not entirely sure that the Second World War didn't take away some of my innocence. That was pretty dramatic, pretty traumatic to have your dad go off and be gone for a very, very long time. Then the Cold War comes along, and I think we lost some of our sense of innocence. There ought to be that period, but we still played. Unfortunately, at times we played war, I guess on the assumption that we got to get ready to go off and be cannon fodder. But I don't like this notion that somehow there's something called reason, and it is absolutely and easily, categorically separate from something called emotion. And we'll find theories that suggest that they really work in tandem, so close together that what we're really doing are seeing them in a multiplicative or additive relationship. Uh-oh. I've used words that cause communication students to just collapse. Multiply and add. Uh-oh, I'm talking about, well, we're even building up to this theory, one of these theories, that theory specifically, information integration, has the algebraic formula associated with it. Uh-oh. Well, we'll worry about that later on. We'll warn you in advance. You'll be able to show up with your glasses that screen you from having to deal with mathematics that day. Process of influencing attitudes and behaviors. We like to think that attitude is often a predecessor of behavior. What predicts what I will do? My attitudes will predict what I do. Therefore, if I change your attitudes, I can change your behavior. Now, we've also introduced something that I have to stop and go off on an aside with, and that is that only in the last number of years have I had to try to convince people that you have many attitudes. And the reason for that is that all of a sudden from somewhere, I have no where it came, there was the notion, she's got an attitude. He's got an attitude. I've got an attitude. No, you've got many attitudes. Attitudes are simply evaluative judgments. Some people would say, well, that's not how we deal with it out in current conversation. Current conversations taken a perfectly good word and made it hard for you then to understand it in the context that I'm going to talk about it here. Because if you look around the world around you and you have opinions, positive and negative, do you like the tile in here? Some women would look down and say, that's terrible tile. Men look down and say, it looks pretty solid to me. That's good enough. We'll go with it. The walls, these are not terribly attractive walls. Women might look at it and say, this is a crummy building. Men might say that and say, oh, it's okay. We evaluate, we judge. We are a judgmental people. We sort. Now, why do we do that? Because we have to. On the assumption that we'd like to deliver to ourselves rewards and try to avoid negative outcomes, is that true? Is that human behavior? We then have to be able to figure that out. Attitudes are supposed to inform our judgments between what is preferable and what is not preferable. I won't embarrass people by asking them to reflect upon various foods. I hate liver. I even actually kind of hate the concept of it. My mother tried to get me to eat it, and I didn't like it. My experience with liver was, it's yucky. My wife likes liver. A good friend of mine that I have lunch with, Dr. Lee, likes liver. Preferences, attitudes. Is he likely to order liver? Yes. Meaning his attitude can drive his behavior. Am I going to order liver? No. Not unless it is the last food in the world. And I'm not sure I wouldn't rather have a widgery grub, which we talked once about, before I ate liver. I'm not sure. And the reason I say that is I've tried liver. And it's possible that widgery grubs actually taste better than liver. You know, reality television to me would be making me eat liver. Well, you see what I'm getting at is we have the world divided into a lot of these preferences. We are people that like preferences. Marketing is based upon preferences, isn't it? Advertising is based upon preferences. What do people like? What do people dislike? And can we create attitudes? Can we create attitudes that change the likelihood that people will behave? Well, that's a good way of looking at it. Now we can make that even more complicated in talking about this. If this one will go back up, or if our slide will go back up, processes of social influence through the interaction of knowledge, attitude, and behavior. Now I've added another word in there, haven't I? Knowledge. We've, for a long time, talked about KAB relationships. Knowledge, attitude, behavior. One of the things that's interesting is that we often thought originally that K precedes A, which precedes B. But is it possible that it's B, K, A, meaning that you do something and you like it? And liking it, then you study it and become more informed about it because, among other things, you want to be able to do it again. Back to our children. Children have food put in front of them. Some of you parents know this. They look at it, they eat it, they like it, or they don't like it. If they like it, they want to know the name of it, so they can ask for it. And they learn words like cookie pretty early. They're far less keen on knowing the word carrot. And rutabaga isn't anywhere close. You see what I'm getting at is we begin to sort the world. Some of our attitudes actually come about because of our experience of our behavior. How am I going to know what liver is like until I try it? That's what my mother said. Try it, you may like it. Can you convince me that I like liver on the knowledge that liver is good for me? So you see how these work in a relationship, but they are separated, and sometimes the order is rather interesting. A number of years ago, reversing the business that attitudes lead to behavior, there's a whole school of behavior change and attitude change theory that said what you first of all have to do is to change people's behavior, and they will then take on attitudes that conform to their behavior, because we don't like for our behavior to not fit our attitudes and our attitudes to not fit our behavior. How does that play out? Your parents tried to form in you a variety of attitudes by their control of your behavior. I will not ask whether it worked, but that's what they tried to do. They tried to get you to behave in a particular way on the assumption that you would take on the attitudes then that they wanted that would be predictive of that behavior. And sometimes they didn't go into the business of why you need to do this, it's just you do it. You don't say certain things when grandmother's around. And then you might want to know why, and they might tell you, but the thing that they're focusing on is the behavior. You do that and you're going to be good. You may get a Reese's peanut butter cup. You do it bad and you will never see light again in your lifetime. Why do we send children to their room as opposed to sit down and expose them to a long and extended discussion? Is because we figure that behavior will force a change of attitude. Now, we often find that it may not, but that's the logic. You see what I'm getting at? That's the logic. And again, I would say that's how real all of this is. Back to our slide again. All of this is subject to the relationship between attitudes and behavior, or knowledge, attitudes, and behavior. Well, okay. In one sense, then, we can turn our attention to how all of this becomes a part of where we are today. Where we are today. One of the earliest bodies of research in this regard was what is often called the Yale Learning Theory Studies. And it's interesting to note that the Yale learning theorists were sensitive to, or very much aware of, many of the assumptions that we've made before. For instance, let me ask you this question, if you remember from the exam and the study for the exam, something about terministic screens. To what extent are terministic screens attitudes? To what extent are terministic screens attitudes? Yes, my coach over here is saying, can we please get this up? Thank you. Okay. Keep reminding me, because I don't often look out of the corner of my eye. I have pretty good peripheral vision, but I don't always look out of the corner of my eye. Could we please get our Yale learn? Oh, there we go. Now I'm so happy. Thank you. Or you're happy too. When you and I are happy, then everybody's happy, right? I have no idea what I was talking about. No, I was talking about terministic screens. Do the words that I use to define the world impose my attitudinal judgment on that world? Yes.
Or society's attitudinal judgment.
Or society, or some subset of society, right? Some subset of society. So I cannot see the world in a neutral way, would you say?
Yes.
Yes, you would say that's right. Cannot see the world in a neutral way. That's pretty powerful, isn't it? The Yale researchers knew that. I don't know whether they explicitly knew Kenneth Burke, but they knew that. Words drive our sense of reality. Well, what does all of that mean? Well, let me go back a little bit. Does it bother you in any way to think that attitudes and learning theory ought to come together as a package? So that's what I'm building up to here. The Yale learning theorists were given a huge amount of money, largely from the federal government, to try to figure out how persuasion works, particularly in a mass communication context. And there's a lot of ideology as to why that came about, but I think that's enough for us to talk about here. The Yale learning theorists believed that we learn attitudes. Now, that's kind of interesting, because what then does that assume that other people had argued? Some of you have studied the history of psychology, or the study of psychology, and one of the theories in psychology said that we as human animals are subject to a lot of drives. Is that what you were going to say? Subject to a lot of drives. Now, the truth is, we probably are. I've got a good friend, world-class biologist, who likes to see us as nothing but a bunch of hormones, physiology, and endocrinology. But the thing that he can't explain is, how can we get so complex over that that we then have what a lot of other animals don't have? Meaning, if we left the world to itself, food would be pretty much just the natural taking of some other thing, wouldn't it? Whether it's a carrot or another animal. But we as a human society have invented cuisine, ranging all the way from Reese's peanut butter cups on one end to tofu on the other end. We've got wonderfully prepared foods, French cuisine, Italian cuisine, home cooking, all of this kind of thing. Now I'm making you terribly hungry, and I apologize. Your eyes are rolling back saying, can we go eat? We're starving. Well, how do we acquire all of that? Maybe we are at some level interested in drive, but beyond that we get to be pretty complicated. It's hard to deny certain of our drives. We have a drive to breathe. You don't go long if you don't have that drive. If that isn't there and you come into the world, you've got a half-life of just a few minutes. So maybe we have a drive to breathe. Maybe we have a drive to at least almost procreate. And I'll leave you to your imagination beyond that. We have a lot of these kinds of drives, don't we? But to what extent do some of those drives then begin to, well, let's just play out, for instance, this whole notion of sex. That's what I was talking about. Advertising on television. Here you are, you're beautiful. Here you are, you're masculine. We sell hair care products. We sell shaving products. We sell hygiene products. We sell automobiles. We sell fashions. We sell all kinds of things. That somehow has something to do with sex drive, is it? I don't know. We could build it all on that. I don't know. But it gets a lot more complicated and elaborate because of who we are as the human entity out here, right? Well, anyway, the argument by the Yale learning theory people was that, back to my slide, thank you. People learn attitudes that lead to rewarding outcomes and avoid choices that are not rewarding. Thus, persuaders can provide information that helps persons learn attitudes. That's the essence of that theory. What do you think? Does that make sense? We go through our life learning what we like and what we dislike. If that's the case and that is natural, then can I try to prevail upon you to influence you in that way? As parents, we do. As friends, we may. One of the things that we know that peers often are more influential on one another in interpersonal communication than mass advertising is. Does that make sense? You can't remember, some of you, an age when we had a lot of tobacco advertising on television. We don't have tobacco advertising on television now, do we? People used to smoke for the first time. Do people start smoking today for the first time? Is it advertising that drives our smoking, or is it somebody saying, hey, you want a cigarette? See? In my own mind, everybody in my community smoked except my mother. She was dead against it, and rightfully so, probably. But what's interesting is that smoking wasn't a big deal to us as guys until a hoodlum showed up from the eastern slope out of a big city to bring culture to us farm boys in western Colorado. Fonzie, white t-shirt, cigarettes rolled up in the sleeve. We had seen civilization. Up to this point, we had been isolated. We couldn't wait to start smoking. Actually, as kids, my 3 cousins and I had smoked as very small kids. We thought we were hiding. Our aunt, their mother, my aunt, was watching us with a great sense of amusement that 3 kids have gotten some water-soaked Camels and are trying to learn how to smoke them. Why do we do that? Well, we talk about something like sensation seeking. Maybe that's a biological drive. But you see, after a while it becomes an industry, doesn't it? It becomes a lifestyle. It becomes a culture. We have cultures of smoking, etc., etc. When my wife was a sorority girl, it's strange that we would call them that, woman, at the University of New Mexico, part of what they did was have smoking lessons. If you're going to be a sorority woman, you have to smoke in a particular way. And one of the rules is that a cigarette will never be out of your hand unless it is in an ashtray, meaning that you're not going to have a cigarette hanging out of the corner of your mouth. There is an etiquette to smoking, isn't there? Now, that's the way the women do it, and men smoked in somewhat different ways. We had cigarettes hanging out of the corner of our mouth. We wanted to look tough. Smoking maybe has nothing to do with nicotine at first. It has to do with looking tough. So you let the cigarette hang out of the corner of your mouth. You smoke it in a certain way. You got a flair about you. It's your identity. It is your style. It is all of this. Well, isn't part of this that whole business of as an individual trying to sort through life and figure out what's going on? Marlboro Man comes by. Does he influence me? Maybe so. Does Virginia Slims influence me? Maybe not, but does it influence my sister? Well, she's older. She was smoking long before I was around. But the notion is that we go into life not knowing what are rewarding and unrewarding experiences, and we use this business that we typically then call persuasion to try to sort through and see what happens. Well, the Yale researchers, if we can get the slide up here, believed that the persuasion process had some component parts to it. They suggest, for instance, that one of the first things you have to do in persuasion is to gain attention. Any of you in advertising know how many times, according to advertising research, people see an ad before they ever recall having seen it? Typically it's 3 times. If you're in advertising, how difficult is it to get anybody to see your ad? First of all, there's a lot of what we call ad clutter, isn't there? Secondly, when the ads come on television, do you sit there glued? Or do you get up and go somewhere, do something? Meaning that there's a lot of incentive to not pay attention to advertising. But attention. Pay attention. My parents said that to me just before they set into trying to make me a decent, reasonable human being. First of all, got to get somebody's attention. What's also interesting is that the Yale researchers believed that we had to be able to comprehend the message. We take that very much for granted sometimes, don't we? And sometimes it also becomes a rather interesting gender-based kind of phenomenon. Over the years, my wife and I have bought lots of stuff, and she has the bad habit of assuming that I know what I've just been told that I'm willing to agree to. But it's a guy thing, isn't it? We're afraid to ask questions for fear somebody would think we're stupid. So we buy any number of things, not having any idea at all what we're buying, but always denying that we could ever not be completely and fully knowledgeable on every decision that we make. It's a guy thing. That's why we never stop for directions. We don't want to lose this aura that we know what we're doing, even if we don't. And we play all of these games. But to what extent may I not understand something? Well, we even go further, don't we, nowadays with information such as warning labels on alcohol and tobacco products. We talk about nutrition. Do you, as you get ready to make a purchase, pick it up and look on the back and read the nutrition and see all of this kind of stuff? Would that influence my purchase of Reese's peanut butter cups? I keep finding it amazingly wonderful that they keep telling me that chocolate is good for you and peanut butter is good for you. And there's even a better peanut coming out that's really good for you. And I ignore the fact that the thing is probably loaded with salt and sugar, which are not good for me. I know it's there, but I don't want to think about it because I like that combination of peanut butter and chocolate. But we do a lot of things that we don't necessarily comprehend, and advertising may do very little to help us to comprehend something. If I'm watching a car ad, and some of them I don't comprehend at all, this car ad out there where 3 people are walking along, a Jaguar runs through and a guy decides he wants to buy one, I don't get it. Maybe I'm missing something there, but I don't get it. I don't even comprehend it. But comprehends means that to some extent I have to understand the message. I have to be able to know what people are talking about. And I'm not sure that's ultimately that big of a deal, but maybe so. All right, now we have anticipation. Anticipation means that with this attitude, what I've just learned, I can then anticipate positive or negative outcomes. Is that what advertising tries to do? Get us to anticipate positive, usually, avoid negative outcomes. Use my product and your waxy buildup will just go away in a heartbeat. Ring around the collar will never happen. Your teeth will be whiter. I'm just delighted to see all of these people buying all of these strips. And isn't it wonderful? The woman walks in and the only thing that you see is these beautifully white teeth that she's got. White teeth become the essence of our identity. I anticipate that when I walk into a room that all of this good is going to happen. Well, you see what happens to we guys is we get confused because we see these beer ads and here is some lonely sucker out in the middle of the wilds of Colorado by himself except for a 6-pack of Busch beer. Pops one open and all of a sudden beautiful women come out of the woods. So I drive to Gunnison, Colorado, go up into the hills a little bit, because I'm a lonely guy. I get out, I got a whole case. I mean, I'm that lonely. Got a whole case. I sit down, I open Busch beer, and well, I'd say, well, maybe it's bad. I'll try another one. And pretty soon I may not care that nobody shows up out of the woods, but what's the likelihood that somebody is going, well, 2 of them particularly, right, come out of the woods, and I'm the only guy in 1,000 miles, and, well, we're back to, oh, don't want to talk about that. Anticipation. Evaluation. I anticipate something, and then the question is, to what extent do I evaluate that I got it and that I got what I thought I would get, and was it as good as I expected? We do that, don't we? We go through that sort of thing. One of the reasons that we even offer taste tests to people is, here, try something. Some of you guys know that the height of your weekend is to go down on Saturday, you're nodding your head, to Sam's, hang around at Sam's, and you can just graze all day long down there. Why are they giving you all of that stuff? So that you then immediately rush over and buy a whole load of it, take it home and put it in your freezer and then forget about it until it spoils. That's what we guys do. Acceptance. To what extent do my attitudes after a while become a part of my whole being? I mentioned before, I'm not a very good target market for a lot of products. My wife asked me these chilling questions. What are you going to do if they ever quit making the aftershave that you have used since 1957? I don't know. It's a scary prospect. I would have to try something different. If Chrysler Corporation goes out of business, what are you going to... I don't know. Because I'd have to buy a Chevrolet or a Ford. That's a scary prospect. If John Deere quits making tractors, I don't know. If Porter Cable quits making tools, I don't know what I would do. My whole lifetime is based upon a very narrow set of attitudes which I've refined, because one of the things about attitudes is they cut through to the chase, don't they? They let us make a lot of decisions, and we don't have time to go through making all these decisions over and over and over and over again. So I'm not a very good market, because what my buying behavior changes are could be rather narrow. But by the same token, all of a sudden I'm becoming a new market. I'm becoming a market for burial plans. I'm becoming a market for adult diapers. So all of a sudden, when I think I've got all of this solved, I realize, no, there are new market issues that I've got to deal with out here. So I have to learn new attitudes and sort things out for the first time. Well, you see, what happens is we're using this attitude stuff to begin to make lots of decisions that go on around us. Now, retention. I will tantalize some of you. You've seen the latest ads. This is hay fever season. For those of you on the DVD side, you'll never know what hay fever season is. This is a lecture given in October. Some of you think, finally, October is cool enough to be out of doors, but I can't go out of doors because this is the hay fever season. The one good month in the fall that I can go outside, I can't go outside because the world of pollen is out there. But then all of a sudden, all of these products are advertised, aren't they? They know, those marketers do, what are the seasonal reasons why we go and get these products. It's kind of fun to me to watch something like WNG out of Chicago and watch the flu ads with everybody all muffled up, and I'm sitting down here in Houston and it's 78 degrees, but I remember what it was like to be in Champaign-Urbana in January. Not fun. Okay, they market this product, that product, this product, that product. Okay, I've got the sneezes. I go into the store. Can I remember what I just saw on television? That is this great miracle allergy medicine that is guaranteed to allow me to go out and never, ever, ever sneeze again. Because if I can't remember it, that ad wasn't any good, was it? Well, then we have decision heuristics. Do you buy the cheapest because it doesn't make any difference? Or do you buy the more expensive because you develop the decision heuristic that you get more if you pay more? So you see, there we are, trying to sort the world out. Claritin, is that our answer? Is it Dimetab or whatever else is out there? Are these our answer? This is our salvation? We have to be able to remember that. So here we are, exposed to all of these messages, and then we're asked to make a decision, and does it get called up? Well, all of this is what the Yale researchers thought about. There's an even longer version of this, in a sense, on page 180 in the book. You people in advertising and marketing ought to love this one. Being exposed to a message, attending to it, liking it and becoming interested in it, comprehending it, learning how to process and using it, yielding to it. We're going to talk more about yielding later on. Memorizing it, retrieving it as required, using it to make decisions, behaving in accord with the decisions, reinforcing the actions, consolidating the decision based upon the success of the action, and so forth. Well, what happened is that the Yale people worked really hard to understand how the decision process, behavioral process works. What are the elements, what are the ingredients, and where can you intervene to make influence? If it's a new product coming out, I have to first of all get you to even notice the message that tells you about the product which I'm trying to get you to pay attention to. So there's a logic to this. The logic is no more clever than arguably this is how people think. This is how people choose. This is how people behave. That's what persuasion theory is all about. Trying to understand those three aspects of the human mind. And so we get into these kinds of models. Well, I've told you that these folks then become interested in how all of this begins to work. Before I go into the next slide, which will be up in a minute, therefore breaking the Yale Communication Research Program down according to the elements of the communication model, I mentioned to you how communication influenced and informed these persuasion theorists. I want to break a couple of the terms out because they're very important to us. Again, one of our friends, McGuire, who I referred to, said that ultimately in persuasion, there are two global important elements. One of them is receiving. Paying attention, getting it, thinking about it. Receiving. How many times are you exposed to a persuasive message that you just simply don't receive it? Okay? The next thing is yielding. And these are terms on the review sheet. Reception and yielding. Yielding means giving into it. Now what's interesting is that yielding presupposes, and we could debate this perhaps for the rest of the semester, presupposes that the process of yielding is a relatively thoughtful process. It is a reasonably willful process. Do you believe that? Do you believe that? Or do you believe, heaven forbid, in my mind, even in something such as subliminal influence, where influence can occur that I don't even know that it's occurring? Well, you see, this is what these guys were interested in. One of the reasons I say that is they were also very much aware of the propaganda research that had transpired. And if you go back and remember that one of the influences that was prevailing in the United States in the 40s, 50s, leading up to 1960s was the increasing interest in the dominant communication model, the linear communication model, the magic bullet model, driven by propaganda theory, and the notion is that you can sneak in and put ideas in people's minds to which they will yield without them ever having any resistance. Yeah.
Could you please repeat the idea about reception according to
Reception is simply, all of this stuff is out there in the world. In a way, what predicts that I will even receive the message? Meaning letting it into my, what do we want to say? Do we want to say consciousness? Consciousness, I like that. I'm not one that likes unconscious or subconscious. It freaks me out. It does, literally, honestly. I don't like the assumption that people can do stuff to us that we are totally unaware of. I don't like that. Some of you do. Some of you want to know the answer to all of that. Some of you want to believe in subliminal advertising in an absolute way. See, I don't believe in it. I think that we are pretty conscious people. I think that we're consciously looking for things, and one of our theories really makes that explicit, suggesting, for instance, that what really drives our attentiveness, processing, and thoughtfulness of all of these messages is the extent to which we think anything relates to our self-interest. So we get into that line of analysis as well. Well, let's quickly go through the SMCR model. You might remember that our old friend Berlow in 1960 made this very, very popular. It was floating around as the Yale people were talking about this. Researchers such as Schramm were talking about this. It was pretty well established. Source. The Yale people wanted to know to what extent and in what ways can the source of the persuasive message be more likely to be influential. And it's interesting that to some extent they turned the clock back 2,000 years to our old friends in Greece. A guy by the name of Aristotle said that character is a crucial part of the persuasive process. Who we think the source of the message is, what we think about the source of the message. I will not ask you to identify yourself, and I hope I don't bait us into a long and tedious debate. But I can argue that society as we know it in America today is easily divided into three categories. One, people who believe that George Bush, President 43, is right on every issue. If George says it, his credibility is such, he's right. There are people out there on the opposite who say anything that George says is inherently wrong. And then in between, there are people that are in varying ways, I don't know, I'm confused, maybe so, maybe not. But in a sense, that talks about credibility, doesn't it? But it also demonstrates that credibility is a two-edged sword. That who may be credible for you may be the absolute opposite for me. Yeah.
I was going to say, then there's a fourth group that thinks you should just go back to school and learn public speaking.
One of the subtexts under that is that people have argued that he suffers from dyslexia and can only understand short statements at a time. I don't know whether there's any truth to that, but I will tell you that it's none of my Republican conservative friends who tell me that. It's all of these fuzzy-headed liberals that I hang around with that tell me that, right? But credibility became very, very important. The credibility research got to be confusing. We knew it worked, but we didn't know how it worked. But there were some variables that seemed to pop up. One is authority, meaning does the person have some authority for speaking on this? Are they knowledgeable? Are they wise? Do we feel unsafe when they make statements? Meaning, are they threatening? Are they trustworthy? Can I count on them? If I were to ask you, who is the most trustworthy person in your life? Who do you always believe? Who do you really believe? You see, now you're beginning to say, that's the person that's very credible. I believe them because it is something that they say. We can talk about how you can manipulate it. Some of the research that they came up with, this is going to sound strange, isn't it? Attractive people, meaning people who are perceived by the target of the persuasion to be attractive, are seen as being more persuasive than people that are less attractive. That's strange because most authorities in my mind look unattractive. You look on CNN and you see these people that are being interviewed. Some of these people don't look very attractive to me, but they're authorities, right? They had a medical guy on that seemed to be enormously authoritative. I didn't think he was at all attractive. So, well, we get confused on that, don't we? Similarity. To what extent am I more likely to be influenced by some source that is similar to me? Peers are very influential on one another. But by the same token, sometimes I find people that are dissimilar. If I'm picking a stockbroker, do I want somebody that's just like me? Or do I want somebody that's a whole lot smarter than me to be picking the stocks and helping me pick the stocks, see? I want somebody smart. If I go into a physician, do I want somebody just like me? I mean, I'm the kind of a guy that believes if you have to go into the doctor in the first place that you're really sick. Stay away from the doctor and then lie to them under any circumstance. But if necessary, they ought to be able to figure this out and tell me what's wrong with me. So we get into a lot of confusion. We know that credibility counts, but we also realize that credibility is often very situational. Credibility is very situational. We like celebrities to sell us stuff, don't we? I'm like Mike. Really? What a bet? Not in your lifetime. Interesting in that regard. Studied on HBO one time. Children allowed to pick tennis shoes of their choice, athletic shoes. But before they put on the pair of their choice, there was colored chalk put on their fingertips, and then they jumped against a wall where the height of their jump could be marked, because they wanted to be like Mike. And they picked a pair of tennis shoes that was based upon their idol. They put those tennis shoes on. What does the ad tell us? You'll jump 1,000 feet into the air when you wear these. The children put them on and they jumped. What was interesting is that some of them didn't jump as high with their new shoes as they did with their old shoes, because arguably they thought the shoes made a positive difference. Did they? Probably not. But we might like that, right? I want to be like Mike. I want to buy something that a celebrity wears. Well, I remember years ago, a guy by the name of Joe Namath. Never heard of him, have you? He was a quarterback, I believe, of the first AFL team or AFC team to win the, what is it called? It's not the World Cup, it's called the Super Bowl. Why do we have this cup thing about sports, right? Cups and bowls. Anyway, he wore a particular kind of aftershave, and women fell all over him. Hey, that's a good idea. If I'm like Joe and I wear the aftershave, women will fall all over me. No, it probably won't work. Well, we'll talk about modeling later on, because modeling is another variation of this, meaning that I look in the world around me and I try to find people whose experience is informative of my experience, and that's one of the ways to think about credibility. Okay, secondly, message. What are the message design elements that can influence the potential persuasive effect of the message? One of these is fear appeals. We like to use fear appeals, don't we? We've sold endless amounts of deodorant based upon the fear of being offensive, or worse, wet. We are a nation that built ourselves on the sweat of our brows, and then we came to the conclusion that wetness was bad. Wetness was bad. Then we kind of made it good again. All those workout ads show just enough sweat so that you really think that there's some reality to them, right? Oh, that's an interesting one, isn't it? Have you ever noticed anybody in one of those workout ads that looks like you? I haven't. Maybe it's just me. You know, their abs seem to be better at the beginning than mine will be after months of anything, no matter what. If they would give me triple my money back, I would take them up on it. But otherwise, the money isn't worth it, right? But fear appeals. Now, fear appeals is something interesting. We talked about a curvilinear relationship not long ago. A modest amount of fear appeals, a minimal amount of fear appeals, may not arouse us enough to think that there is a problem that we have to take seriously. Fear appeal that is too big may actually make us deny and not think about the message. Health communication often deals with fear appeals, doesn't it? To scare people into paying attention. In two countries, Canada and Brazil, cigarette packages now must contain graphic evidence of the potential damage of cigarette consumption. Cancerous gums, cross-sections of tissue. The assumption is that those fear appeals will increase the apprehension of people who are suffering from nicotine deprivation sufficiently to keep them from buying that particular package of cigarettes. Yeah. No? You had your hand on the machine. I thought you were ready to... You just love your button there. It's a sense of power. It's a guy thing, isn't it? You love to push buttons and have, you know, the world respond. Yeah. So fear appeals. Well, let's talk a quick bit about the difference between fear appeals in the United States and maybe another country. In Australia, because the assumption is that you can become hooked on cigarettes, one of the anti-smoking ads had a woman put a cigarette into her mouth and then try to pull it away, and there was this enormous fish hook stuck through her lower limb, her lower lip. Now, of course, in America, we would confuse that with being fashionable, because in the last number of years, we've stuck so much metal into our faces, right? I've often wondered, can some of these people get through out at the airport without having to take their face apart? You know, we won't talk about any of the other parts of the body, just the face, okay? Fear appeals. Would we do that in the United States? Maybe not. How about this fear appeal? Australia, safe driving, don't drive drunk ad. 4 mates, that's what they call guys, have been out at the local pub. They're singing in the car going along. The car tips over, bursts into flames, and the only one who survives is the drunk driver, who now has to deal with the fear of being the guy responsible for seeing his 3 mates burned to death. Or the guy that's going along with his family, and his family gets involved in an accident because he's not attentive. We don't have that kind of advertisement on television in the United States, do we? Why? Because the car industry probably wouldn't like that. And think of all the car ads that are out there. Well, we can get into editorial policy at another time. Sidedness. Is a 2-sided presentation more persuasive than a 1-sided presentation? Should I give pros and cons? Should I just give one side of the issue? We like debates, don't we? We want to see the candidates debate, meaning that we often work on the assumption that just because somebody tells us what's good about their product, there could be another side of their product. And they have to, in one way, perhaps deal with the other side of their product. We even go so far now to make them put warnings at the bottom. Have you noticed that on drug ads? They have all of this, that the drug is going to make you wonderful in a variety of ways, and then at the bottom says, any of you out there that have the following symptoms and do the following things shouldn't be close to this stuff. And I'm willing to believe that's most of us. But nevertheless, the lure of the ad is enough to bring us in. Sidedness, order effects. We know that elements of a message may be differentially potent. Should we put the stronger elements of our message first? Should we put the stronger elements of our message last? Should we put the stronger elements of our message in the middle? That even brings us into a phenomena called primacy effects. Primacy effects argues that the stronger message earlier is more persuasive because it influences then how we will interpret all of the subsequent messages. Recency effects. The last part of the message should be strongest because the last thing that we hear may motivate us most. We know in politics that a lot of people play upon primacy effects, trying to get people to think about our candidate positively early on. But we also know that recency effects comes in because we do most of our mudslinging in the last few hours, because what we want to do is to have our candidate be the one who they think well of. But more importantly, because we know that voter behavior is often against rather than for, we want voters to go in knowing all of the reasons why our opponent should be in jail. Not even a candidate should be in jail. This person should be ostracized, should be sent to some island out in the South Pacific where they deal with people like that. We know, for instance, that language, the potency of the language, affect value of language can make a difference. We know that the informative content in a message can make a difference. To what extent do I learn something that will reduce my uncertainty? Ever heard of that equation? That this is a good product. So we look at those elements. Channels. Of all the channels that we can imagine, which is typically considered to be the most potent channel by which we get persuasive messages? Television, she says. What do you think? No, you think?
I think my friends.
Your friends. Interpersonal contacts. Interpersonal contacts. Want to argue? You give up? Let him have it? He's right. Interpersonal contacts. For a lot of reasons. Most importantly, they fit a lot of the criteria of credibility. They're like us. We think they're smarter. Certainly if they show up with white T-shirts and they've got cigarettes rolled up in their sleeve, they are something, right? All of that sort of stuff. We have to live with them. And we're going to have ideas and attitudes that are like them. Remember we talked about that, we'll talk about it again. We like to have the same ideas, our attitudes as our friends. That's why they are our friends. Now we may disagree with them, but not that much. Not to the point that we really dislike them. Television comes in second, or film. The original studies were film, but then we'd say television today. Why? Because we have two things going on at the same time. We can see and we can hear. We like that. More stimuli. Reading comes in there next. There are people who believe, ever heard these people? It must be true because it's in print. There are people that for some reason we don't know that have a print bias that if you can see it in a book, it has to be true. Okay? Radio is the least because we can't see, we can only hear. Part of that also, the seeing business, is it gives us more cues about the source of the message, doesn't it? As well as it may give us more information about the product and whatever it might be. Finally, receiver. And in a sense, we sort of build up to this, saying that everything that we talk about from here on in the rest of the unit on persuasion gives us increased insights into the nature of the receiver. And why then the receiver is either willing to yield to or resist the message, and even perhaps why the receiver is willing to receive or not receive the message. Well, that brings us then to our second theory, which I'll just briefly preview, but give you an opportunity to go out and do some field level research. A guy by the name of Albert Bandura, who we encounter later on in the course, argues that we spend a lot of time as self-persuaders trying to figure the world out and using any variety of experiences, any variety of messages to try to do something very important, and that is to decide what is rewarding and what is not rewarding. In opposition to the argument that persuadees are totally dependent upon somebody else, Bandura would say it's not true. Or totally passive, Bandura would say it's not true. Bandura's argument is that we know very early on in life that we've got to go about the business of getting attitudes that satisfy our interests, and we do that. We do it because we have a set of goals, which may change over time. But in those goals, whatever it is we want, our effort is to learn the attitudes that are necessary to know to get the behavior that will help us to achieve our goals. And that's how Bandura says we think. So I will have that as your field research between now and Tuesday. Do you agree with Bandura? And if so, well, we're going to explore more about Bandura to see how did Bandura think all of this operated, okay? So we'll see you. Have a good weekend. Lovely weather.